So,
Yes.
yeah, graduate students, postdoc, young professors, etc. So
Mm-hmm.
we get together, we find like topics that we like to discuss. So development finance was one of the main topics. I'm the coordinator of the Latin American working group, along with my colleague Daniel Munevar. And also we have a group that's focused on development economics. So these two groups combined, we decided to do this series. It's going to be a short one. It's going to be you and an economic officer from the United Nations. He's going to present to us on Wednesday. Maybe we're going to have another rounds in the next semester. And then we record the presentations because most of the young scholars, they can't join us at this exactly time, right? So they want to see the presentation afterwards. So is it okay for you if we record?
Yes, perfectly okay. Perfectly okay.
Yep.
And I will send you the PowerPoint. We have one with Luz about CORFO, and I probably have somewhere another one as well. So I can send you them. You can put them later.
Okay, yeah, this will be very, very good. Well, so Maria organized this one. I'm only the one of the coordinators of the group, but Maria is one of the leading members, so she took the initiative to organize this series, and I think that's going to be very good. We're going to have some discussion here. I want to thank you a lot. Well, I think that Professor Griffith-Jones, we don't need to introduce because you are maybe one of the most famous in the topics. No, I know that you have a PhD in Cambridge. Am I right?
Yes.
In economics, and you are now teaching at Sussex and IPD. You are still affiliated to IPD in Columbia and at Sussex University, right?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much. And Maria, maybe you can go ahead. In theory, we have 20 to 30 minutes for a presentation, and after that, we're going to open for discussion with the participants. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Marcos. Hi, Stephany. I'm very glad to have you here. Thank you for joining us. And yes, the idea of the web series is first today to present both the international and the national perspectives of development finance. So Stephany will now present two papers, one about the European Investment Bank and its role in the region, and another one, a second one on CORFO, that's the Chilean National Development Bank. So I'll give you the floor, Stephany, so you can present, and then we have some questions and answers for the scholars here who would like to discuss on that. Yeah.
Well, it's a great pleasure to talk like this. I'm glad we mastered the technology, which is not my strength. I really welcome this initiative. I think it's great to have a dialogue with younger scholars. I want to talk a little bit in general at the beginning, do a sort of introduction, and then to talk more specifically about development banks. So I want to start with just saying very briefly that the financial sector has certain functions. Like, in particular, it should support the real economy, encouraging and mobilizing savings, intermediating them at low cost, channeling them into efficient investment, including in key sectors like innovation and structural transformation, and managing risks for individuals and for companies. But in fact, what we have seen, particularly since the global financial crisis, but also before in the numerous crises in emerging economies, that, sorry, I should have said first that the other function that the financial sector should fulfill is that it should do no harm to the real economy. It should serve the real economy, but it also should do no harm. And the financial sector has been very bad. The private financial sector has been very bad in doing both. It has neither served the real economy properly in normal times, nor has it avoided financial crises. In fact, it has contributed in a major way to do that. So after the so-called global financial crisis, there has been a recognition of these limitations of the private financial sector, including amongst mainstream thinkers. People, you like on the left or Keynesian or Minskians, have always been very critical of the financial sector. But now this this has become a broader agreement, including many mainstream economists, because they have seen that the private financial system is procyclical instead of being countercyclical. That is, it lends more in boom times and less in bad times. That it has not funded SMEs sufficiently. It has not funded innovation. It's particularly bad at providing long-term finance. And if not regulated properly, it has been a major cause, as I said, of financial crisis. And so the consensus goes even to the IMF, where Madame Lagarde has said we need a financial system that serves society. And the other coin of these criticisms of the private financial sector has been, if you like, the rediscovery of the value of public development banks, the positive role which they can play. This has been very clear, for example, in Europe, where the European Investment Bank and national development banks have been given a very big role. And it's also been very clear and important in Asia, where under the leadership of China, but also with many other countries, we have the creation of two major regional or multilateral development banks, the Asia Infrastructure Bank, Investment Bank, and the BRICS Bank. And I think what is interesting, therefore, about this renewed emphasis, it's sort of pragmatic response to the limitations of private finance, but at the same time, it implies, and this is something that actually a Chinese colleague told me when I was presenting these ideas in Beijing, it means a sort of change of development finance paradigm, because we're moving back again, if you like, to the mixed economy paradigm for development finance, which was so prevalent after the Second World War, where under the leadership of the US and of Keynes, the World Bank was created, and then the regional development banks, Inter-American Development Bank, and Asian Development Bank, and others. And we are returning, if you like, to this mixed economy paradigm, because I think one of the interesting things to stress that public development banks are not purely government. The capital is contributed by national governments, but they fund themselves usually in the private capital markets, and they lend mainly to the private sector and often co-finance with private banks or private investors. So it's precisely this mixed economy element that I think is important to stress. But at the same time, because the capital is owned by governments, and particularly these governments have a clear industrial policy or a national development strategy, then they can be a very valuable instrument to implement the strategy. And again, now there is a return of interest in industrial policy and what is called the development state. This was discussed many years ago by people like Alice Amsden and Robert Wade, but it now has a new name with people like Mariana Mazzucato talking about the entrepreneurial state. There is, again, I think across the economic and political spectrum, much stronger support. I would say particularly in the non-Anglo-Saxon world, on the continent of Europe, in Asia, and also a renewal of interest in Africa. In Latin America, maybe we're going a little bit backwards, because there is, of course, particularly at this present moment in Brazil, there is more the tendency of reducing the size of a very large development bank, BNDES, which has been one of the main public development banks in the world, and which represents a very large proportion of development finance in Brazil, particularly of long-term finance. So and we're talking here about public development banks at the three levels. The multilateral development banks, where we have par excellence, of course, the World Bank. At the regional level, where we have, as I mentioned already, the Inter-American, the African, the Asian Development Bank. We have the sub-regional ones like the CAF, the Corporación Andina de Fomento, which is now the Development Bank of Latin America, and we have now these very important China-led banks. But where, for example, in the BRICS Bank, we have participation of India and Brazil. And in the case of the AIB, 57 countries initially joined, and now another 20 have joined. So it's becoming a really big new institution with a total capital of $100 billion. So I have estimated that in about 15, 20 years, it may be lending as much or more as the World Bank. So these are new, both emerging economy development banks, but also, as I say, they have this modality of public development bank. And before I continue, I would just like to mention, have a little ad, if I may, that I have written several papers on this, but most recently I have, together with Jose Antonio Campo, we have got a big project comparing national development banks. And we have compared 7 development banks, 2 from outside Latin America, the 2 most successful and largest, the Chinese Development Bank, and which has about $2 trillion of assets, sort of small change, and the KfW, the German Development Bank, which is the 2nd largest commercial bank in Germany. And then we have 5 Latin American case studies, which are Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Peru, and Chile. And I want to talk a little bit about the Chilean case study, CORFO, where I wrote the paper, and it's co-authored by Luz, the chair of this session. So before I talk a little bit more in general, I want to just refer to the first paper I distributed, which some of you have maybe had a chance to read, where my colleague Giovanni Cosi did some simulations. And what is interesting, and this paper has been published in a book by Neumann and Joe Stiglitz. And the idea behind the simulations was to show that in a climate where investment is low, particularly in the European Union, but also more generally in the world, what we call the business as usual scenario will not generate much growth and employment. And then we devise a second scenario where we involve the European Investment Bank, which I haven't had a chance to explain. The European Investment Bank is what is called the house bank. The Germans call it the house bank of the European Union. The capital is contributed by the 28 member countries, still 28 before Brexit, and it is one of the largest development banks in the world. And that has been called to play a very large role after the Eurozone debt crisis. So it has been extended, this role, through a thing called the Juncker Plan, which aims to increase lending by over 300 billion euros till 2020. And it has been actually expanded now to 500 billion euros. So it's a very large impact. But that is what we call the business as usual scenario, which combines this Juncker Plan with continued austerity. So with continued low levels of public investment at the national level. The second scenario is that we use for the simulation is having a bigger Juncker Plan, putting more public resources into the European Investment Plan, additional one, but also taking away fiscal austerity, particularly in the Eurozone South, and allowing for higher investment. We call this the Lighthouse Initiative. My colleague Peter Boffinger, who's a leading Keynesian economist in Germany, saying that all governments should be allowed to have 1% of GDP more public investment, including the poorer countries, but also countries like Germany, because they all have very low levels of investment. And of course, public investment crowds in private investment, particularly in conditions of the current time of loose monetary policy. And the third scenario we have is one which we call global investment, where we assume that also the emerging economies will enhance, and the developing countries, the poorer countries, will enhance the role of development banks and will enhance fiscal investment. And we get very interesting results in the simulations because we get that the world economy will only grow with business as usual at 2.7%, but with a bigger role for public investment and development banks would grow at 3.1%, and with a global strategy would grow at 4.3%. I don't want to bore you with numbers, but comparing the 2.7% with 4.3% is almost doubling the growth rate. And this is particularly strong for the EU, but also significant, doubling for the United States, for poor countries, for example. The African low-income countries, again, the growth rates would increase significantly. And also the unemployment would fall, particularly in the southern Eurozone, which is where the focus of our interest. It would fall, not sufficiently, but it would fall in a significant way. So I think this is a nice illustration, of course it's always approximate, of how using public development banks, plus having a bigger role for public investment through the fiscal account, can lead to more rapid growth, higher employment, and actually reduce debt to GDP ratios. So I would like to talk a little bit about the four or five functions that we think are important for, I will skip actually the theoretical and historical framework, but we can come back to that. But I will just say very briefly on the theoretical framework that, of course, after the Second World War, we had the predominance of this mixed economy approach, which was, I think, very successful. It was very high growth for a number of reasons. But one of them, there was this support for public investment banks. But then the efficient financial market hypothesis came, and the best thing that governments could do would be to pull out, not regulate, not have public banks. And in that kind of narrow, efficient private financial markets, which was very strong, of course, in Latin America, particularly strong there, starting in my own country, Chile, then Argentina, but also all across the region. We had the case that public development banks almost by definition were seen as bad. And one of the big paradoxes was that the World Bank, which is itself a public development bank, went around Latin America and Africa, they were less successful in Asia, telling the countries that to be efficient, to grow more, they had to close their own development banks, forgetting that they themselves were development banks. But after that, we have the return, if you like, of theories. First, the work of people like Stiglitz and Wise and others, which say, no, private markets are imperfect. They are riddled with market imperfections. In fact, market failures are much more prevalent in finance than government failures. I think that's an important point. And much more so than in other sectors, and that makes a very strong case for public intervention. And the public intervention can be done through regulating financial markets and through having public development banks. So instead of begging private banks to do something, you just instruct your public development bank to do it. And I think a very important issue there is that the public development banks have to be good. They have to be well run. They have to be independent of both political and private interests, which is not easy. But I think we have good examples. And in this project, we have studied in some depth, also from a political science perspective, how come that banks like KfW are so well run and manage to have so much political consensus. So the development banks have, as I pointed out, several functions. The first one, of course, is precisely to fund long-term investment, to support structural transformation in the context of national development strategies in those countries that have national development strategies. Because interestingly, we found that some countries, like, for example, Peru, don't have a very clear development strategy, and therefore the development banks don't have a very clear mandate. But in other countries where you have a commitment to certain goals, like, for example, developing green energy, which was a very interesting case in Germany. You have a policy framework which subsidizes green energy, and then you have a financial tool, which is KfW, which was told to fund this energy. KfW helped introduce renewable energy, both solar and wind, to Germany. It was, in fact, initially the main financier of this energy, and then it gradually saw its share diminish because the private sector then followed. So this is a very key, I think, role. And because there's been, as I mentioned, this shift towards we need a more developmental state, a return to that. Because people like Robert Wade and Alice Amson used to write about this in the 60s, looking at the Asian models of Taiwan and Korea and so on. But there is now a return, and what is interesting about the work of people like Mariana Mazzucato is that it shows that it's not just the Asian countries, it's not just Germany, but even in the United States, a lot of the initial innovation, like the iPhone, is actually funded by public sources. So you have to have initially very large public resources, either through grants or through public development banks, which then will catalyze the private finance that will lead to investment in new sectors. Because the private sector doesn't like uncertainty. And if you're going into new sectors, new companies, you don't have enough certainty about what the returns will be. And only the state with if it has a very long-term perspective, it has a development perspective, can do that. And therefore, development banks are, I think, one of the valuable instruments to fulfill that function. So that's one first, I think, very key function of development banks. A second one, which has been also very widely recognized, is counter-cyclical lending. People like Jose Antonio Campo, and to a certain extent myself, have been stressing this for a long time. But now it's become acknowledged because we have the empirical evidence that in the aftermath of and during the so-called global financial crisis, which was actually a crisis of the US and Europe mainly, both the World Bank, the regional development banks were very counter-cyclical. And I've done a paper on that. We saw that lending commitments went up by 70%, over 70% between 2008 and 2009, which helped sustain growth in the emerging economies. And at the same time, national development banks also, and this is illustrated by a very good paper by the World Bank, went up by about over 30%, almost 40%, on average in all countries that had them. And one of the interesting things is that there is also empirical evidence that those countries where development banks are a larger part of the total financial system, you have a bigger counter-cyclical effect. That is, there is a bigger increase in total lending, because of course, if you have a very small development bank, like the case of Chile that I will mention, even though it's very counter-cyclical in the sense that it increases the lending quite a lot, because it's small in relation to the total financial sector, the impact will be small. And the other interesting result, which is empirically shown, is that those countries that have large public development banks have also a quicker recovery of growth, because the fact that the lending is smooth gives you space then to finance growth. And it's very important. I mean, there's a growing recognition that you need, that central banks and the IMF have to provide counter-cyclical liquidity in times of crisis. But what we are now beginning to understand is that equally important is for development banks to provide counter-cyclical long-term finance. Because if not, what happens, you stop investing. And then you damage via aggregate demand growth in the short term. But perhaps even more importantly, you're damaging the future. You have 10 years, lost decade like we had in Latin America, lost decade in much of the Eurozone now. With low investment, you are going to damage future growth. So counter-cyclical lending by the development banks can play a big role to ameliorate that. A third function is that it can help develop financial markets in ways that increases counter-cyclicality, and also it implies having a more diversified financial system. And I want to talk a little bit about the last point, because if you look at the theory of finance, people talk a lot about how individual financial institutions should have more diversified financial system. Diversified portfolio. But what people don't say is you should also have a diversified financial system. And if the risks are not correlated across institutions, so if you have public development banks and private banks, if you have large banks and small banks, cooperative banks versus traditional banks, and they all take different risks, which are not necessarily so highly correlated, you may have less systemic risk. And you also have different banks doing what they're good at. So you have different banks playing to their comparative advantage. For example, public development banks are good at long-term finance. Maybe private banks are better at funding trade credit or big multinationals. So you have a kind of specialized, diversified financial system, which is a point which, for example, the efficient financial markets theory had ignored. So I think this is a very important point. And you can have mechanisms that actually increase this countercyclicality. And an interesting point that was raised in our final conference, which we held recently in Washington, was that perhaps a challenge for development banks is to develop more countercyclical financial instruments so they're ready to act when there's a crisis and when you need to increase financial loans. A fourth function is that development bank can play a role to support greater financial inclusion, both socially and geographically. That is, they can either directly or indirectly finance SMEs, they can finance poorer regions. Typically, for example, development banks sometimes have a network of branches throughout the territory, including poorer areas. And this is a very important role. And the case of CORFO is, for example, that I will talk about soon, is also an important example. But you also have the Indian development banks, the Chinese, and so on. And finally, last but certainly not least, and perhaps one can think most importantly, public development banks are very good at funding public. Is everything all right?
There's a microphone on. Could you mute, please?
Me? I'm just going to move. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Stephany.
Okay.
No, maybe we have 5 more minutes, and then we'll go to open the ground for questions and answers.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Yes?
We started a little bit late, huh? I'm just going to get something. I just want to connect to the power so I don't run out of battery. This is very intensive battery. Okay, so I just want to talk about there are a number of global public goods, but of course the most important one is mitigating and adapting to climate change. And I think this is a new instrument, this is a new function that development banks need to perform, which is to fund a major structural transformation towards a greener development model. And this is true for both developed, emerging, and developing countries. And of course, people like Carlota Perez argue that this not only saves the planet, because we can't exist without this planet, but also it provides new economic and business opportunities, but often they're very risky, and so again the private sector on its own will not take it. And what some of the interesting things that banks can do, public development banks for example, is to evaluate projects using shadow prices which are reflecting the amount of carbon emissions. And so for example the European Investment Bank does a project evaluation, which is the commercial one, what is the commercial return, and then it looks at what is the return if you take a shadow price for carbon emissions. And sometimes it decides to do a project even though it's not so commercially attractive, but because it saves energy, fossil fuel emissions and so on. And of course for that you need to mix lending with subsidies, and that is I think a very interesting mechanism which you can do but more easily using public development banks. So I just want to now very briefly talk a bit about some of the case studies, and particularly about the case study that Lucy and I studied, which is CORFO. So CORFO was one of the first development banks created in the world. It was very large. It used to fund about 30% of investment in equipment in the country. But now it's rather small. Now its total exposure of its portfolio is about 1% of GDP, which compares, you know, with other banks. It shows that it's very small if you compare not only with its past glorious history, but also with other development banks. Very interestingly, KfW represents about 14% of GDP. BNDES, the Brazilian one, 11%, and the Chinese one, 12%. So you have these very large banks in proportion to their country, whereas CORFO is a small one. And we can talk about more of that in the discussion. I would say from the evaluation that we did and the interviews, that on the whole, that whatever CORFO does, and in general what the other development banks do, NAFINSA and so on, in Mexico, they do what they do very well. They're very effective. And they are both funding traditional sectors like SMEs quite well, and also going into new sectors, interesting activities like entrepreneurship. CORFO is going into entrepreneurship. It's doing a new program called Startup, which is seen as very successful broadly. And it goes into new sectors like green energy, which of course in Chile, with its driest desert in the world, has massive potential. In fact, Luce studied that. So it does what it does very well. But the problem, the problem that it has is that what it does is too little. And I think an important point I want to make that became clear to me when I was doing these interviews in Chile, that we need larger development banks in particular now. Why? First, because in countries of Latin America, they are facing much lower commodity prices than they did in the commodity super boom, so they cannot rely on exports of commodities. In the past 15 years, we could say, maybe, you know, this is not such a good model, but at least it was delivering growth in countries like Chile, but more broadly in the region. But now, structural diversification is yes or yes. I mean, you need structural diversification, and therefore you need to have instruments to achieve it. And as we said, public development banks can be an important instrument. A second challenge, which is a more long-term challenge, in Chile, but I think worldwide, productivity increases have slowed down. The increases in productivity, for example, in the Chilean economy, but it's a problem also in the US, in Europe, and so on. Productivity increases have slowed down very significantly, and therefore you need instruments so that you go into more efficient, fund more efficient investments. And there was a new point that emerged in the discussions, for example, with the former head of CORFO. When I interviewed him, Chile is a country which relies for its exports very much on commodity exports. And some of these commodities are very intensive, of course, in natural resources. And these natural resources are very limited. I learned, for example, that to make 1 liter of wine, you need to have 100 liters of water. And the Chilean territory is quite scarce in this water. So you can't continue increasing the production of Chilean wine for exports, nice as it is to drink. So that forces you to go into other sectors. And a final point is that fiscal policy is getting very tight, partly because there are real macroeconomic constraints, but I think also partly because the perception is that the response to the crisis has to be to limit fiscal deficits. And if you have a country like Chile, where you have a lot of spending under the current government going to the social sectors, which is a good thing, but then you have little money left to spend fiscally on public investment in the structural transformation. And therefore, if you have a public development bank, which allows you to leverage resources, because co-financing and so on, you can, with little fiscal resources, have a bigger impact in encouraging investment. I just want to very quickly say that one thing that we picked up very much in the work we did in Chile with Luz and our other colleague Javiera was that there has been a change in the instruments used. And this is also true in Mexico and Nafinsa, which is to shift from giving first-tier loans to what is called second-tier loans, which means lending through other intermediaries, through, for example, commercial banks, and also shifting more recently from loans to guarantees. Yeah, so it's a very indirect approach. It isn't CORFO or Nafinsa going and lending, but it's really facilitating the lending by the commercial banks, and therefore in some ways being much more passive in terms of the channeling of the money. And this is different. This is a very Latin American phenomena, and it's different in the case of KfW and the Chinese Development Bank, which have not gone down this route. So I think that's a very interesting feature. So just to summarize some of the main conclusions from the project and of the lecture is that we have worldwide a return of development banks. You know, development banks are back because they're needed for a number of reasons. In Europe, for example, here in the UK, where I am, the British Labour Party, which almost won the election but didn't, has in its program the creation of a new public development bank. The Germans are increasing. There's a number of countries are increasing. Same in Asia. This is less in Latin America because we have, for example, that the current government in Brazil, the current government is beginning to reduce the scale of BNDES, which was seen as key. And we have Nafinsa, which has shifted to only second-tier lending and to more limited number of instruments. So here, Latin America is going a little bit against the trend. And then we have interesting issues we don't have much time to discuss. Some countries like Colombia, Peru have a system of national development banks, have several more specialized by sector, whereas others have one development bank, which is big, like KfW or Chinese one or BNDES, which is better. It's better to have more specialized or more a sort of big monobank. Secondly, I think the final point is, which I've mentioned but in passing, is that you need to have an important link to government policy. So where governments have a clear policy, either sectorally or in general, and the interesting case I think is, for example, China and Germany for promoting renewable energy. Yeah, Germany has had a very clear, perhaps too strong system of subsidized feed-in tariffs, and then it had this financial instrument. The combination of both led to this massive increase in renewables. Or if you even better have a broader development strategy where you choose certain sectors, then you can go and you can say to the development bank, do this, and you give them a clear mandate, and they are more efficient. And also one interesting thing that came in the paper of KfW, the development bank can also contribute to designing these policies. So it's both a policy taker and a designer, because it has the ability, it knows technically the sector, the different sectors. It has experience with evaluating the projects in ways that perhaps government administrators don't. So you have this tension, this creative collaboration between governments and public development banks, where you have clear government policies and well-functioning development banks. So I think one of the challenges, for example, for poorer countries in Latin America or Africa, how should development banks be created and how they should work? Because the challenges of development there are greater and the need of development finance is bigger, but then the institutional development may be somewhat weaker. So I think I've spoken a bit too long, but we did start a bit late. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Stephany. It was a pleasure to have you with us today, really contributing to the whole discussion on development finance. And as Marcos said before, you're one of the leaders in this area. So it has been really nice to hear you. And just to open the floor, I will maybe pose two questions. One of which you have already answered a lot about CORFO and its role in Chile and in the Chile developmental plan. As you have said, Chile's productivity level after the commodity price have plummeted is facing a lot of challenges. So what do you think are the main challenges for CORFO to stop following the neoliberal agenda and stop shrinking its size? And what has happened, as you mentioned already, is that CORFO stopped granting concessional loans, and because in order not to compete with the private sector, it started only to guarantee the loans for the private banks. So in this way, it retreated and it stopped crowding out, right, the private banks, and it started complementing what private banks need, that is to reduce its risk. So my question is basically with the challenge of Chile and of the whole Latin America region of trying to be more productive and diversify their activities and taking the advantage of this new momentum that the Finance for Development agenda is having, how could these banks in the Latin America region take the advantage of this momentum, and what should they do in order to grow and start being more impactful in terms of development, if you have a view on that? And the second one is about the European Investment Bank, and also, well, we all know what the crisis of the European Union is facing now. And from my point of view, in order to stop that crisis and to prevent this going further, what needs to be done is to reduce the inequality within the region, right? And in your paper, the both scenarios that you were forecasting of a growth of investment, they were both good for the European region as a whole. However, this is not reaching the gap within the region. And how do you think that the European Investment Bank could play a role in order to reduce this gap between the north and the south region of Europe, right? So that are my questions, and I open the floor for other scholars who would like to ask. You can use the video, the microphone, or as Marcos said, also the chat here.
It's good if you can introduce yourself.
Yes, I didn't do that. So my name is Luz, and
I know who you are, but the other scholars.
Yeah, for sure. If you can introduce yourself before posing the question, please.
Maybe they have the thing muted. I think.
Yeah, well, they need to unmute themselves, but most of the people, they don't have access to the mic, so commonly they write down here in the chat. Maybe we can start like with the 2 answers, and then after we do another round with the questions. That's fine?
Okay, okay.
Let's do that. Yeah.
Or maybe they can write in the meantime, and then Luz can read them out or something. So I think, yeah, both of your questions, Luz, are very interesting. I mean, one of the points that you remind me that we have in the paper, which I think is very important, is the fact that if you need a bigger CORFO, in the case of Chile, which has already a very deep capital market, a very developed deep capital market, and which has also access in rather favorable terms to the international capital markets. An idea that I started discussing there with the policymakers is that CORFO could, which is now currently only funded by public resources from the budget, could actually be funded from an increase of the capital, and the money could be raised on domestic and international capital markets. So you wouldn't have to raise too much public money, which is always scarce, or people think it's scarce. They don't want to raise taxes. And you could also then, in this way, achieve the leverage, like KfW does, like the European Investment Bank, like the Chinese Development Bank does. And I think this is something that hasn't been thought through enough in the region. I think this would be more difficult in a country like Brazil because the capital markets are much more complicated, particularly for long-term finance, and of course the interest rates are very high, which is something that actually the current government is trying to change, but it's complicated. But in countries where you have deep capital markets, you should be able to do this. So I think that's one area. The other area is, as I said, once you had more resources, once you had returned to broader instruments, including credit, there are major investments that are required in the Chilean economy. For example, Chile today, as a proportion, exports less refined copper than 10 years ago, which is really bad because the copper is now exported in less elaborate form and then is refined in China. So one of the challenges that people in CORFO and in other places in Chile talk about is that you should have bigger refineries in Chile to elaborate copper, so that they can move up the value chain. This is an obvious thing that we've been talking about for 50 years, but it's not been done. So if CORFO had sufficient resources, it could put together packages, maybe with the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Chilean private banks, and finance a massive refineries, which would be, of course, very expensive. I don't know, $2-3 billion, but it would increase the value added of the exports, which could be very valuable because it would give a lot of foreign exchange, which could then fund imports for broader sectoral diversification, increasing of wages, and so on. There are other areas like further promotion of green energy, because the potential is very large. The private investors have done a lot, but there are also areas which need further doing. One other example is that because the Chilean desert is so hot and so dry, actually the solar panels produced in China are not the most adequate because they burn out. Can you go away? Thank you very much. They burn out too easily. And so there is the idea of having technological research, which could be funded by CORFO and the universities, on how to make these panels last longer in the particular conditions of the Chilean desert. There are a number of fiber optics, communications, and so on sectors that one could think of. So I think very much the idea is to try and expand the role of CORFO, to explain that these institutions are efficient. And I think one important thing that was done, because there was a challenge in Chile, there were people even on the center-left that wanted to actually close down CORFO. And it has been shown to be very efficient. And therefore, it has been saved, but it's been saved in this rather small role. And so to take this, if you like, more assertive role, which is one of the things I like about Mazzucato's work, she says we have an entrepreneurial state. It's not the sort of traditional bureaucratic state or the passive state just to deal with market failures, but it's a state that knows where the economy should go and takes risks, as it has done in the past. Now, your second question on the European Investment Bank and the whole European model is also very interesting, Luz, because this is precisely a problem that has arisen with the Juncker plan. The Juncker plan is giving more resources to the European Investment Bank, and the European Investment Bank, together with the private banks, have increased lending a lot, actually, which is good. And it's probably contributing, therefore, to the European recovery. But very few of those resources go to the poorest countries, the Greece's, the Portugal, Spain, and so on. And there is an issue about, and it's actually a concern of the Juncker plan, whether through technical assistance, through quotas, through special and other measures to encourage more flows going to these countries which need it the most. And of course, it's always difficult because the countries like Germany will have the best projects. And so if you're a public development bank, you want to lend to nice projects, well evaluated, where you are more likely to get paid back. But if you have this development function, and I think this is the same for poorer countries, you also have to lend to the poorer regions, to the weaker, maybe, companies and so on. So there is, if you like, the tension always between the commercial and the developmental. And on balance, the developmental and entrepreneurial function is the one that should prevail. And where necessary, you may need to put in even some grants. But I think this has not been done with sufficient strength. And so countries like Greece, for example, have not had sufficient support from the European Investment Bank. And I've studied the Inter-American Development Bank in the past, and they have the same problem because it's difficult to reach, for example, small countries, poorer countries, which have less capacity. So how to strengthen that capacity?
Thank you very much, Stephany. And I think we have another question.
Unmuted.
Colleagues, Danilo, will you please?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, thank you very much, Luz, and thank you very much, Professor Griffith-Jones, for this presentation. It was really interesting. I am Danilo. I'm a Brazilian scholar, and I'm currently doing my PhD in UNU Merit in the Netherlands. And I have a question concerning the critiques that the public development banks have been receiving recently. I mean, especially in my country. Actually, there is a liberal narrative that put the role of the National Bank of Development as one of the main villains of the current economic crisis. So this has been generating a lot of problems for the ones that defend the role of these institutions as a driver of economic development. So I'd like to ask you your thoughts on how can we defend the role of the public institutions right now in a situation where they became the main focus of attack from these liberal scholars? Thank you very much.
Well, that's a very good question, and of course it's very relevant, as you say now, in Brazil. I think that the first thing is to make the positive case, and we have in this project a very nice paper, which I can send you, the draft of, which is written by Rogerio Stewart on BNDES, and which argues precisely, looking at these functions, that BNDES has performed these functions, has supported innovation, has supported SMEs, has supported important investment in infrastructure, very necessary, and that these functions still are there, these needs are still there, and that therefore you continue to need a public development bank. I think that on the margin one could maybe, but I don't have enough knowledge of the detail. I think that, and the other argument he makes is that, of course, some of the problems, which is the fact that the interest rate which BNDES lends at, which is such a subject of a criticism, which is so much lower than the normal market interest rate in Brazil, is a problem. And the way he addresses it, I think rightly, is saying that the problem is the market interest rate, and that more effort needs to be done at through macroeconomic policy so that the interest rate is lower. And in that, I have some sympathy with the attitude of the government that says we should try and lower the market interest rate, although I'm not sure with all the problems that there are in the economy and in the politics that this will be possible. But I think clearly there should be perhaps a bigger role for the BNDES to help develop private capital markets. But I think there the main challenge is the macroeconomic policy. But I think overall, overall I think BNDES has performed very well. There is one question which I have always had, which I probably wouldn't say in public, but since we're amongst friends, if one thinks that BNDES has done all these good things, why was the investment rate in Brazil not higher? And I think that is a question to be asked. I mean, one could argue that without BNDES it would be even lower, and it's very difficult to have a counterfactual. But I think that it is a valid question. But I think that the viciousness of the attack and also the narrative, which is based on a purely kind of ideological neoclassical narrow perspective, is completely wrong. And it uses some possible mistakes or perceived mistakes to try and undermine the whole valuable role which BNDES has played. And I think there's also a wish to move precisely in this direction that I described of moving towards guarantees and away from loans, reducing the scale of the bank, even using it for privatization, which would be exactly the opposite of what one would think is desirable, which is very sad. And it's very sad also because in the past, while most of Latin America went along this neoclassical route, either closed development banks or reduced their scale, like in Chile, especially in the Pinochet, Brazil was the exception, and it maintained its public development bank, which did a lot of good things. And it's very, very unfortunate that, if you like, this bulwark of public development banking is now under attack. And so I think it's very important what you and others, including people in our project like Felipe Resende, have been doing, including in the press, to challenge, this with an alternative narrative. I hope that answers.
Stephany, so I think we have one last question from Marcos. Marcos, please share.
Yeah, well, if there's no other question, I can make mine. May I have? Yeah, let's have one first. Olga, she wants to have a question. Well, since I'm one of the organizers, I feel that I need to give space to the participants. Olga, do you have the microphone, or you want to write down?
Did.
Please go ahead.
Yes. Hi. Thank you very much for letting me to speak. Just briefly, yes, my name is Olga, and I'm doing studies of development banks in East Asia. And I did quite a bit of interviews there, and both in successful and not so successful countries or institutions. And my question would be, it looks like more successful banks like Korea, initially in Singapore, now in China, where more strategic investment choices were made by economic planners or economic bureaucrats. So my question would be, to what extent development banks are strong enough nowadays, when we do not have this issue with this notion of economic planning to such extent as we had after Second World War. So to what extent development banks today can be strong enough to make these strategic investment choices, or whether we need to rethink and better operationalize the issues of national industrial policies?
Very good. Do you want to have your question as well, Marcos? Very good question, this.
Yeah, well, mine is very quick. I'm just wondering if you have a comment on the, well, the project, of the Multilateral Development Bank of Latin America that they were created in 2007. That's the Banco del Sur, so the Bank of South. So I wonder if you have thoughts why the idea didn't go ahead, because I'm kind of working in a paper with Daniel Munevar, that's another member of the group. He's in UNCTAD now, and he was here with us in the call, but he needed to disconnect.
Was what?
And now he needed to disconnect. So he's not in the call anymore, Daniel Munevar. But our idea is that, well, in the end, it's the same as CAF is doing, But in the beginning, the Banco del Sur, it was proposed to be a very different way of development bank, of a multi-development bank. But in the end, it was maybe the same as CAF. So that's why it didn't go ahead. I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that, any comments on the Banco del Sur. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, both very good questions. So in terms of the first question, I think the need is to think in a modern way, because I think the kind of investments that were done in East Asia or even in Latin America, for example, CORFO created a lot of the companies, which were then state companies, for transmission of electricity, for telephones, a number of steel, sugar, all these were key areas of the model of development in those early post-war period. And of course, the Asians were more advanced. They did their own sectors. I think what you need now is much more, electronic stuff, nanotechnology, all this very sophisticated stuff, which maybe needs a different model, both of industrial policy and of financing. So I think, of course, you do need to strengthen the national planning, but you have to probably do it in a different way. If I can take a sort of shorthand, a sort of more Danny Roderick industrial style policy. I think there is a belief now that the private sector cannot do it. Even the right, even in the UK, they talk about economic planning, although I don't think they do it. So I think we have to rethink, and I think it's a very exciting challenge for you youngies to think what economic planning means in this new world economy. Not just from the kind of politics of it, but also in terms of where the technology is today. And that's what I think the work of people like Carlota Perez and Mariana is so interesting. What kind of, and then within that, what kind of modalities of development finance are necessary? For example, CORFO now has, and all these other development banks, doesn't have so much ownership of companies, but it has funds of funds, equity. So it takes, it invests through these equity funds, or it subsidizes particular companies, particular areas. So it has, if you like, more indirect tools, somewhat more indirect tools than, as in the past, you would just establish the company yourself and you would run it yourself. Although the Germans, interestingly, still do that. I mean, KfW still has shares in public companies. I think it's very interesting to study what some of the advanced economies of Norway, how they do it. Because a lot of myths, everybody thinks that the developed countries are very free market, but they're not. They're not. They use a lot of the so-called old-fashioned tools. And so we maybe have to become a little bit old-fashioned at the same time as being more flexible. On the South Bank, the Banco del Sur, I don't know the details. You probably, as you're studying it, know more. But one thing that I was really shocked to know, because people talked a lot about the Banco del Sur, and then once I asked at a conference how much it lent, and they were a bit reluctant to tell me, because in fact they didn't lend at all. They never got off the ground. And I think behind that there wasn't trust of Venezuela, who was the leading actor. I think the Brazilians and possibly even the Argentinians had a very ambiguous attitudes towards doing it because they didn't trust they would do a good job. And plus, as you said rightly, you have in CAF now called the Development Bank of Latin America, you have a very powerful institution, which I think is doing things rather well, which has expanded very dramatically. I mean, the growth of the CAF in sectors like infrastructure, including green infrastructure, is very, very impressive. And so the issue of why you should create a second institution when you have one that is so good and that perhaps could be improved or expanded, it was not clear to me, and it seemed a little bit more like political. Plus, of course, now Venezuela has no money even to fund its own imports. So it's an idea that was very linked to the super commodity boom, and it would have been a good idea then, but I don't think it's so current now. I think it's quite interesting that the CAF, that the Asians actually talked a lot to the CAF when they were creating, and to the European Investment Bank, that when they were creating the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and the BRICS Bank, they consulted very heavily with the CAF in what works, what doesn't work. And I think that's also something very nice that I've been involved in, is how one can extract lessons, what works and what doesn't work. So these new development banks, for example, in Asia, have this wealth of knowledge on which they can build in terms of what instruments, what works, what doesn't work, to extract positive and negative lessons. And I think they're doing it very actively. So one would hope that all this experience can sort of build on it. Of course, if you face like a purely ideological attack, like you have in Brazil, then it's more complicated because they're not really interested in learning the lessons, but they're interested in just destroying what there is rather than improving. So that's, I think, a big problem. I think the big challenge is also for poorer, smaller countries. Africa is very interesting because there's again a sense of feeling in countries like Nigeria and Ghana and Kenya. There's some interest in fact, in Nigeria, they created a new development bank because they feel the limitations of the private financial sector. Governments of different persuasion are trying to go back to creating them. And I think, for people like you who are beginning your careers, I think it's a really, really exciting area of research and policy work.
Okay, so I think that we are ready to close the floor. Thank you a lot, Stephany. It was really great for all of us. I think we all learned a lot. And let's stay in touch. Let's stay the network going. So thank you a lot, all of you scholars, for being here as well. And anything else you would like to add, Stephany?
No, it was a real pleasure. It was very stimulating, and thank you very much for the invitation. I look forward to staying in touch.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Thank you.